Space is never complete and finite. It is motion connected to the next space and the next. So we're talking about space when we talk about a grid and how the space within a design is connected. Gestalt. This will be a quiz question. All of us have the desire for basic unity and harmony. Images are first perceived as parts. We see the whole before we see the parts that make up the whole. The eye-brain will organize the components into a more comprehensive, unified whole. If we are confronted with too many unrelated parts or units, the eye-brain attempts to simplify by organizing the units into a manageable whole. When this is not possible, the image will appear unorganized and chaotic. Space connects elements. Wide spaces separate, narrow spaces connect. The closer elements are, the more related they seem to be. Graphic designers need to always consider the space within their elements or dividing their elements. Fine artists also use grids when they work. This is an example of Annette Messenger, a French artist known for her installation work. She uses photographs, prints, and drawings and other various materials. And she would bring these photos together, hundreds of photos, and she would basically hang them on these strings that were precisely placed, kind of equidistant from each other. And she would create these really beautiful installations. Here's a close-up. And these are all parts of the human body. So she's commenting on the human body in this work. This is another portion of this installation, and you can see how the dimensions vary, but how precise the spaces are between each photograph. Another installation. Her husband was named Christian Boltanski. He was also is also a very well-known artist, and he's a French photographer, sculptor, painter, and installation artist. And his work did comment on World War II. He was talking about kind of the problems of death, memory, and loss. He wanted to memorialize the anonymous and those who disappeared in World War II. And here's a part of his installation. He often used lights, but you can see how precise the hanging was. So it's not completely consistent in a grid, but there is a grid happening here. There's a very detailed thought process about where these photographs are in relation to one another. He also did these projections in his installations. And here's another image of his installation, focusing on the eyes. And these were black and white photographs, and he used these tin boxes, light bulbs, sockets, and transformers to create this very beautiful, haunting installation using light. Another example of some of his installation work, you can see there's these lit up photographs in these kind of big sculptural elements here. All interestingly placed, a lot of thought process taken to that space. He did one called Shadow Boxes, or he did actually multiple installations where he would use these shadow boxes to create this effect. And here's just an amazing view of a part of his installation and how many photographs were used. Thousands of photographs used. Sophia Calle is also a fine artist who does a lot of grid-based work. In one installation, she asked sightless-born people or blind people to express their vision of beauty, and she would take photographs of them and then show their answers. So here she asked this adolescent girl, what was beautiful, and this girl described this voluptuous female form she had once ran her hands over in a museum. She did another project in a hotel where she got a temporary job as a chambermaid, and she then photographed the rooms, and she would lay out this montage of photographs or this grid-based design using the photographs and write her comments. Here's another image of this work. Bernd and Hillebecker were fine artists working in the late 50s, early 60s, and they began taking portraits of modern industrial buildings, old factory sites, and their subjects as buildings were anonymous, but they were taken all over the world, and then they were presented kind of collectively. And you can see how taking all these buildings and then laying them out right next to each other, how it's interesting, it's saying something. This is another viewpoint of this particular show they did on these buildings. Very grid-based. You can see how meticulous that spacing is between the images. Piet Mondrian is a Dutch painter. He was also very committed to using a grid in his work. And a grid doesn't mean everything has to be equidistant. It means everything is considered. So you really kind of deal with the space in different ways using a grid, but its main purpose is to aid you in this organization. Here's a close-up of his work, and another close-up he uses red, yellow, and blue in this particular painting. This one's titled Broadway. Andy Warhol also used a grid. He was the central figure in the movement known as pop art. And you can see some of his prints, and he would take these old photographs, he would replicate them, he would place them in different ways using a grid. Here's Jackie Kennedy, Muhammad Ali. And this is just a dialogue in the style of strip cartoon where he's speaking about fame. Andy Warhol. Here's Mickey Mouse. And this is just anonymous. In this installation there's text, these photographs. I think they're Polaroids of different text styles, some of them graffiti, some of them printed, and then they're all placed next to each other in a very grid-based design. That's another one. So all of these photographs are interesting individually, but when you place them next to each other, they change and they start to be about something bigger. Here's just an example of a photograph that's sliced and then put back together. How does it change the content? It really does make an impact when you separate and then put things back together. So grids are used almost always with multi-page documents. Once you feel comfortable with the fundamentals of design, you can begin to lay out a single page. But for multi-page designs such as books, magazines, newspapers, brochures, websites, and annual reports, you have to use a grid sometimes to maintain unity. You really need to create emphasis, unity, and balance throughout the pages. So open basically almost any magazine, book, newspaper, and count how many columns you see. How are the visual elements organized? And you'll see that almost always there's a grid in place. And this is an example of a 1-column grid, 2-column grid, and 4-column grid. You can see the 4-column grid. This really makes the design balanced and consistent, which is very important in multi-page design, and it provides flow from one page to the next. This is a column brochure for Klein bicycles, and you can kind of see the 1-column grid here, the 4-column grid. There's a 2-column grid happening in this space. When you get to something like a newspaper, grids are crucial because you have so much text. You have to figure out a way to make that text work. The more text you have, the more challenging layout can be sometimes. So it's very precise. You can do these diagrams, or if you're working in Illustrator or Photoshop, there's grid tools you can use to create this separation of the space, and then you really just use it as a guide for yourself when you're doing your layout. Sometimes, you know, especially when you start looking at things like typographic deconstruction, designers like David Carson, you'll ask yourself, is there a grid in place? And the answer might be no. A grid isn't always used, But whether you use a grid or not, if you choose to abandon the grid, then you have to look at whether the design has a sense of unity. Is it organized? Is it too chaotic for the viewer to really look at it? So Emigre magazine, a very experimental magazine, I encourage you to look at it. You can Google it and see some of the designs, and a lot of type art, but there's really interesting layouts. So grid is not apparent here. However, the layout has been carefully planned because there's unity. I like looking at these designs. And this is another example. Very chaotic, but there's something about it. I like to look at it. It's commenting. There's a visual organization. Partly this is there because the color unifies it. There's a color consistency. The shapes are repeating. There's a little bit of variance in scale with the flies so that it doesn't look too uniform. So great design occurs when the individual parts are all interesting and you want to look at them, and the whole is interesting to look at, and it has a visual consistency. And so here's an example of very organic design. These are very organic shapes. Using a grid, they've been laid out and organized so that there's a front, back, spine, there's the CD inside, and they all look very visually consistent. And if you looked at these letters here and how they're laid out, and you look at the consistency of the layout, there was a grid in place when this design was created. Joseph Müller-Brockmann, he was a pioneer of Swiss graphic design, which was very grid-based. And he did this whole book on the grid designs, and it's amazing. So if you get a chance, look at this book. And here's some of the pages inside of it. The whole book was done with this amazing grid in place. So it's very consistent, very organized. But the images or the designs that he shows in the book are very powerful. And one strategy with Swiss design was to use a lot of photographs, maybe isolated colors. So they might choose one color or two colors, and then they would lay out text in a very precise, organized way. So the photographs themselves could be very fluid, very organic, very dynamic, but the text was always considered in this style. You can see it's just beautiful use of scale in some of these photographs. And the book itself, this beautiful grid. So this, you can see the columns. This is a 4-column design here. You can see 1, 2, 3, and 4. So some of the areas are actually taking up multiple columns. Okay, you can see some more of the grid-based work and more of it. So here is a poster using a grid. You can see that there's a very, very careful attention in determining where the start of the words occur. There's thought with how much space is put in between the lines and the letters themselves. Here's another one. There's kind of a line occurring here, you can see. So grid systems help you lay out design, and it helps create this visual consistency. This is a very free image, but then this text is very precise. There's a lot of thought taken to each letter and the placement of each letter. And in Photoshop and Illustrator, you have grids that you can just pop up onto your screen, and then that really helps with the layout. So if you're working with one of those two software programs, put the grid in place before you lay out your text or even your image, and you'll find that it helps you kind of separate that space and understand what portions of the space contain specific content. So an example of a grid in place, and this could be something that you designed in Illustrator or Photoshop, and you create this grid. The red lines are representing the grid, and here it is as the final design. Everything beautifully laid out. And if you see this, beginning designers, sometimes there's a little bit too much space or they're not perfectly aligned. It makes a huge difference in the organization and the unity.